Luck is when preparation meets opportunity, and this could not be highlighted any more than by the events of September 15, 1942. On that historic afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Kinashi Takakazu of submarine I-19 looked through his periscope and saw the dream that any submariner would have wished: a U.S. carrier task force running right across his path. The unlucky, soon-to-be victim was the carrier USS Wasp. Kinashi unleashed 6 torpedoes, then dove to safety, anxiously awaiting the results of his attack. Unfortunately for him, he would never come to truly know that he had just launched the most devastating torpedo salvo of World War II. There is a larger picture to this engagement that I feel is important to consider if we want to understand why the Wasp had been caught in this unfortunate position in the first place. And it relates to important events that had previously occurred on the island of Guadalcanal. The Marines' tenure on Guadalcanal had slowly improved but was still far from secure. As of August 21st, the 1st Marine Division had just 6 infantry battalions. These were not enough to hold their long, 5-mile defensive perimeter around the airfield. There were talks of them being reinforced soon, which was encouraging news since it was clear the Japanese had not given up on trying to get rid of them from the island. Following Ichiki's disastrous impromptu attack at the Battle of the Tenaru, a more coordinated effort was planned to recapture the airfield. The 35th Infantry Brigade, under Major General Kawaguchi, was assigned to this mission. Using destroyers, this force, amounting to 6,200 men in all, would be sent piecemeal to Guadalcanal in nightly landings. The first of these destroyer runs was scheduled to arrive on the 28th of August, but it ran into trouble. Due to a shortage of fuel, the convoy made their approach at an economical, modest speed, not the fuel-intensive high speed they should have been traveling by. The result was that they were spotted in the early evening, and an hour later they were set upon by Cactus Air Force bombers. In a crippling attack, 2 destroyers were damaged, and a third, the Asagiri, was struck by 2 bombs, which resulted in a powerful explosion. She split in half and sank, taking sailors and army passengers with her. The convoy retreated. The disastrous opening of this reinforcement operation gave cause for concern to the Japanese High Command, and for a second there, they considered abandoning all hope of taking back the island. However, this setback ended up being an exception to an otherwise successful operation. Over the next 8 nights, the majority of Kawaguchi's men were landed on Tavu Point successfully. In parallel to these nightly landing efforts, an air campaign was taking place to diminish the air strength of Henderson Airfield and keep the Marines off balance. Rabaul launched daily air raids that hit Henderson and at times struck shipping in Salvo Sound. A notable success during this period came on August 30th, when they caught a destroyer transport off Lunga Point. The unfortunate ship was the USS Kohun. The Japanese Betty bombers displayed incredible marksmanship in their level bombing attack, hitting the transport a total of 4 times and scoring many near misses. The Kohun sank with the loss of 51 crewmen. Here's a photograph of the Kohun sinking. The massing of Kawaguchi's men on the island did not escape the attention of the Marines. They knew an attack was forthcoming. Given the urgency, they combined the depleted parachute and raider battalions that were on Tulagi and sent them to the Big Island. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, this battalion was placed on a small ridge south of the airfield. This was determined as the likely avenue of approach the Japanese would take, which would turn out to be exactly right. Kawaguchi's men departed Tavu Point and marched west along the coast. On September 7th, he issued his orders to his men. His plan consisted of a bold flanking maneuver inland, using the jungle as cover to surprise the enemy as he attacked the southern perimeter, which he believed to be lightly defended. To add complexity, he would have 2 battalions conducting diversionary attacks on the wings to lock the Marines in place while his main force, 3 battalions strong, made the main breakthrough. Clearly, some flaws can be seen. Instead of concentration, we see a division of forces. On top of that, the plan was complex and required timing and coordination to succeed, something difficult to accomplish in the jungle at night. Further spoiling his chances of success was that he was entering the battle with flawed intelligence. Intel had continued to underestimate Marine strength by placing it at 2,000 men. This was utterly wrong. The Marines outnumbered his 5 battalions with their 7. But before we discard any chances of success Kawaguchi may have, we must remember that he holds the initiative. He can choose when and where he will attack and outnumber the enemy at the point of contact. So, all in all, we shall see that it's going to end up being 3 battalions versus 1. Not too bad, and with some luck, he has the possibility of succeeding. The date of the attack is set for September 12th at 2000 hours. As soon as Kawaguchi's men pivoted inland, they immediately discovered the dreadful conditions the thick, tangled jungles of Guadalcanal had to offer. There were no roads here. Contact and coordination was difficult to establish, the heat was unbearable, and the troops found their strength slowly weakening as they trekked to their assembly areas. To highlight this struggle, all of the battalions arrived late to their assembly areas for the main attack, thus postponing the starting hour. Now gathered, the battle finally began in the last hours of September 12th. But the opening assault completely misfired. His force crashed into Marine positions west of the ridge. Units became intermingled and command and control was lost. As they tried to sort themselves out, American artillery caused heavy casualties. By the time Kawaguchi established control, there was only an hour left of daylight. There's a great quote from him that explains the failure of this first attack. Because of the devilish jungle, the brigade was scattered all over and completely beyond control. In my whole life, I have never felt so helpless. Further irritating him would have been the knowledge that his 2 diversionary units didn't even contribute to the battle. Both had assembled too far behind the front lines and arrived too late to participate. The Marines correctly assumed that the Japanese would attack again the following night, so they pulled back to stronger positions on the ridge. On the night of the 13th at 1830, the final climactic attack occurred and was initially met with success. This time, Kawaguchi's leading battalion pushed back the right wing of the Marines. The Marines' left wing was outflanked and forced to retreat. Then, the center Japanese battalion scaled the ridge, pushing the American center back. The battered American companies retreated to Hill 123, where they made a last stand. If they fell, the path to the airfield would be open. However, at this crucial moment, when the Americans were retreating with the Japanese hot on their heels, once again, heavy American artillery saved the day by raining destructive salvos on the Japanese and stemming their momentum. Nonetheless, the Japanese made a final push. This phase of the battle featured vicious, close-quarters combat. The outcome hung by a thread. Marine reserves were fed into the line. The Japanese high water mark was reached at 0530 when a company broke through and reached the outskirts of the newly established Fighter 1 airfield. But shortly thereafter, they were checked. In the end, the Marines held strong and beat off all the attacks. Daylight came and it was clear to Kawaguchi that his offensive had failed. Adding anger to his disappointment were the reports that followed. Only one company from the right battalion had participated in the entire battle. When the battle commenced, the commander was in the rear. He then got pinned down by artillery fire when trying to reach the front lines. He spent the rest of the night trying unsuccessfully to get in touch with his units, and as a result, his leaderless battalion barely took part in the battle. Kawaguchi painfully remembered. This powerful battalion, which I had counted on most, was thus completely mismanaged. When I heard of this, I could not help shedding tears of disappointment, anger, and regret. The two diversionary units did participate this time, but their assaults were ineffective and were easily beaten back. Thus, it can be argued that 3 battalions worth of men had contributed little to Kawaguchi's grand offensive. Kawaguchi had received a tough lesson on how difficult it was to coordinate an offensive operation from the inhospitable jungles of Guadalcanal. At midday, his defeated forces pulled back. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, or later more appropriately known as Bloody Ridge, was over. The Marines suffered 382 casualties. In contrast, the Japanese lost over 800 men. The reason I just spent a considerable amount of time explaining this land battle is to illustrate how desperate the situation had become for the Marines. Despite the heavy losses, the determined attack by Kawaguchi's brigade had nearly succeeded. Edson's battalion was depleted and would eventually have to be withdrawn. If the Japanese kept building up their strength on the island, while Marine strength kept slowly diminishing, who knew if the next attack could be repelled like this one? Thankfully, the Marines wouldn't have to wait much longer in this vulnerable state. The decision had been made to reinforce them. Now, this is where the Wasp comes into the picture. The much-needed reinforcements earmarked for Cactus were the 7th Marines. Traveling on board 6 transports, the vulnerable, slow convoy would need air cover as it sailed to Guadalcanal. Task Force 61, the carrier task force tasked with protecting the supply lanes to Guadalcanal, would escort this valuable cargo. Apart from potential naval forces and enemy airstrikes that could endanger the convoy en route, Task Force 61 would also have to keep a lookout for a new enemy it had recently discovered was equally menacing: submarines. And much to the discomfort to the crewmen on board, they knew they would have to pass once again through their deadly hunting grounds, known as Torpedo Junction. Torpedo Junction was the nickname sailors had given to the waters southeast of Guadalcanal. As the name suggests, it was for the numerous submarine sightings and attacks that had occurred here. The Japanese had come to the realization that if the Americans were indeed committed on maintaining their garrison on the island, convoys carrying supplies would be routinely sent on discernible paths. As a result, they sent their submarines to establish picket lines across these sea lanes in the hopes of ambushing naval forces. At first, the results for this huge interdiction effort were nil, but once they did occur, the gains were immense. On August 31st, Saratoga was torpedoed. The carrier survived, but was sent home for repairs. Coupled with the fact that the Enterprise, heavily damaged at the Eastern Solomons battle a week earlier, had also been sent home for repairs, we can see an ominous dramatic shift in the balance of forces for the campaign. One should bear in mind that the US Navy currently had only 4 carriers to its name. No additional carriers were at hand to reinforce the Navy. Not until next summer at least, when the new Essex-class carriers would become available. After Sarah's and Enterprise's departure, only 2 carriers remained in Task Force 61. The Wasp and the Hornet, which had just arrived in the theater. And I must emphasize the following: this is it. These chosen 2 are all that remain to safeguard the supply lines to the Marines. It goes without saying that it was imperative to conserve this carrier strength for the sake of the campaign. But not even a week will pass before Task Force 61 comes perilously close to losing another carrier. The Wasp had been sent for provisions in Noumea, leaving the Hornet to patrol on her own. On September 6, a very little-known obscure action occurred. The Hornet ran across the path of submarine I-11. The submarine launched 4 torpedoes. By happenstance, a TBF pilot on Inner Air Patrol saw the attack and dropped a depth charge that took out 2 of the torpedoes. The Hornet barely dodged a third by turning to port. Whoa, talk about a close call. The Wasp, having finished provisioning, sailed to rendezvous with the Hornet. On board the Wasp was the newest commander of Task Force 61, Rear Admiral Lee Noyes. Noyes had assumed command of the task force following Fletcher's departure with the Saratoga. Previously serving as Director of Naval Communications, he was assigned command of the Wasp in preparation for Operation Watchtower. He is a mild-mannered, good-natured, meticulous leader. The Wasp was the newest addition to the Pacific Fleet. She had participated early in the war, delivering aircraft to Malta, and only in June was sent to the Pacific. To the regret of her crew, she was refueling when the Battle of the Eastern Solomons occurred, preventing her from aiding her sisters. They were eager to make up for their missed opportunity. On the 11th, Task Force 61 rendezvoused. Now combined, they were told of their new orders to escort the 7th Marines. Like his predecessor, Noyes was not keen on these covering missions they had been ordered to continue. He saw the danger they entailed. By performing static patrols, they were giving the enemy ample opportunity to locate and attack them. But he also had the insight to see the inescapable predicament they were in. The Navy couldn't allow the transport of supplies and personnel critical to the survival of the Marine garrison to trek these waters alone. If they wanted to protect the convoy and assure its arrival, they simply had to pass through Torpedo Junction. There was no way around it. The threat to his carriers was deemed a necessary risk. On the 13th, Task Force 61 was spotted by enemy reconnaissance. This prompted the Japanese to set up a new picket line between San Cristobal and the Santa Cruz Islands. The Marine convoy departed on September 14th, and Noyes assumed a covering position northeast of them. Almost immediately, the importance of Task Force 61 in this mission was made abundantly clear. Enemy carrier forces were discovered lurking nearby. The combined fleet had departed Truk on the 9th. This was the Imperial Navy's participation in Kawaguchi's land offensive. While Kawaguchi's attack took place, they would loiter northeast of Guadalcanal, ready to destroy any American carriers that might come to aid the Marine garrison. On the morning of the 14th, American PBYs discovered Kondo's advance force, and behind it, Nagumo's carrier force. Realizing the danger they could pose to the convoy, Noyes boldly decided to close the distance and prepare for battle. If both opponents kept their course, a carrier battle seemed likely. However, because of the distance separating them, Nagumo and Noyes' air searches failed to discover each other's ships. Furthermore, when news of Kawaguchi's defeat reached the combined fleet, they saw their supporting mission as redundant. So, they decided to withdraw north to refuel. Action had been averted. Likewise, the Wasp reversed course to return to its covering position for the next day. Noyes was relieved the threat from carrier forces had receded, but unbeknownst to him, he hadn't escaped trouble altogether. September 15th. Task Force 61 resumed its position 100 miles northeast of the convoy. As they continued their journey, Task Force 61 inadvertently stumbled right into the newest picket screen the Japanese had set up, manned by no less than 9 submarines. That afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Kinashi was sailing south. He's an experienced commander and had been in charge of I-19 since June. He heard propeller noises on his hydrophone, peeked with his periscope, and saw the Wasp with her escorts sailing past him. What a splendid target, he must have thought, but alas, they were too far to attack. He gave chase, but being submerged, there was little hope his slow submarine would catch up to the fast-moving task force. In all likelihood, the Wasp would soon disappear over the horizon. But this is where fate intervenes and incredible luck is bestowed upon him. As it happens, the Wasp was about to conduct flight operations. This entailed turning into the wind, which was coming from the southeast. At 14:20, the Wasp turned, and the Hornet Task Force, which was about 7 miles northeast, followed suit. Kinashi kept tracking the Wasp and saw her cutting the distance. the Wasp launched 26 aircraft for air searches and patrol and recovered 11 from the morning. She ordered the recently landed planes to refuel and rearm for the next day. Soon, 8 planes would be on the flight deck while 37 were down below, crowded in her hangar deck. It's now 1444. Kinashi peers into his scope, and lo and behold, it's a beautiful sight. The aircraft carrier was running right across his path. At this range, he couldn't miss. Adhering to tactical doctrine, he ordered a spread of 6 torpedoes at this capital ship. At less than 1,000 yards, the torpedoes ran forward. Lookouts on the Wasp spotted the torpedoes, but it was too late to avoid them. 2, possibly 3 torpedoes slammed into the Wasp on her starboard side. Within minutes of the hits, the Wasp had turned into an inferno. Nearby vessels could all see thick black smoke emerging from the ship and knew she was in trouble. The captain of the Wasp ordered the ship to turn so that the wind could blow the smoke away from the ship. This striking photograph shows how lethal the attack had been and the dreadful conditions the carrier now faced. So there is a reason why this attack was so devastating and effective. The Wasp was hit by 2 torpedoes on her forward side. There was a third powerful explosion following these 2, but it is still unclear if it was caused by a third torpedo or the result of a fuel vapor-induced explosion. Regardless, the first 2 hits ruptured the aviation gasoline storage tanks. Almost everyone below decks reported smelling vapor fumes. Their senses proved correct. Fuel was leaking, and at least 1 fire started on the 3rd deck that then spread to the 2nd. And here comes the final nail in the coffin. As I mentioned earlier, the Wasp had just recovered planes and ordered them below decks to be fueled and armed for the following day. They were in that process when the attack occurred. Thus, the aircraft fueling system was active, posing a fire hazard. 37 aircraft were in the hangar. 22 aircraft were fueled and armed, and a further 10 were armed but not fueled. Worsening things were that the powerful blast of the torpedo hits shook the ship violently. Planes that were in the hangar deck were lifted into the air and dropped back down with such force, their landing gear collapsed. Here's a photograph of the Enterprise's hangar deck, and there's something I want to point out here. Usually, spare planes would be stored up here in the ceiling. The Wasp had a similar layout. Well, the violent shockwaves following the hits caused these planes to come falling down on top of the parked planes below. The result was that within seconds, the hangar deck was now a mangled mess of damaged, unmovable planes leaking fuel. The combination of these factors is what doomed the poor ship. 3 to 5 minutes after the attack, a gasoline vapor explosion occurred deep inside the ship. The fires reached the hangar deck, and with predictable results, secondary explosions occurred as the damaged planes that were leaking fuel caught fire and the ammunition and bombs that were laying around all ignited. Damage control parties had got into position to fight the flames, but were disheartened to find that barely any water was coming out of their hoses. That's because the forward water mains had been damaged and were no longer working. In short, the Wasp had been caught in a similar state as the Akagi, Kaga, and Soru had found themselves in at Midway. She had been attacked with no warning and with armed and fueled planes on board. It was the secondary explosions that followed that sealed the fate of the Wasp. A great vapor explosion occurred at 15:05 and another at 15:10. Admiral Noyes himself suffered burns during these blasts. Noyes and his staff, who were now on the aft part of the ship, assessed the situation and found it to be hopeless. The Wasp was shattered. Already her forward deck had been burned through, and there was no effective way to fight the flames that kept spreading thanks to all the fueled and armed planes remaining in the hangar deck. At 15:20, 35 minutes after Kinashi's attack, Noyes made the painful decision to abandon ship. Word was sent, and surviving crewmen gathered aft on the deck to evacuate the ship. In about 40 minutes, the survivors were evacuated. In the late evening, the Wasp was scuttled by a fellow destroyer, and she sank by the bow at 2100 hours. With her went 46 aircraft, and most tragically of all, 173 men who perished from the attack. Following the attack, I-19 was immediately hunted for by Wasp's escorting destroyers. She was depth charged over 80 times, but miraculously survived. Because of these intense attacks, I-19 was never able to confirm the damage she had done, but a nearby friendly submarine, the I-15, did. She saw the Wasp burning and later confirmed the carrier sinking. Now, what both I-19 and I-15 didn't see is what happened 5 miles away to the northeast. And here is what elevates this successful attack into an extraordinary one. Kanashi had no way of knowing, given his perspective, that beyond the Wasp lay the Hornet task force. And as luck would have it, given the angle he fired from, they ran into the path of the torpedoes that had missed the Wasp. The destroyer O'Brien dodged one but was hit by another, tearing off a part of her bow. And the final torpedo, near the end of its run, smacked into the port side of the battleship North Carolina. Here's a photograph of the O'Brien being hit. In the background is the Wasp burning. It's almost hard to believe that this hit you see came from the same torpedo spread 5 miles away. Both ships survived the hits and are ultimately ordered to return to the US for repairs. North Carolina's journey was uneventful. However, O'Brien's takes a drastic turn. Despite losing part of her bow, she was able to make it first to Espiritu Santo, then to Nomea for emergency repairs. During her return to the US, her wounds reopened and she slowly foundered under the waves. All her crew were successfully evacuated before she sank. Therefore, O'Brien, the final victim of Kanashi's attack, sank 34 days after the event and 2,800 miles from where it had taken place. So there it is, the most devastating torpedo attack of the war. I-19 had fired 6 torpedoes and 5 had hit targets. Hitting your original target and then pummeling additional ships 5 miles away with the torpedoes that missed speaks volumes of the superiority of Japanese torpedoes. I-19 sank a valuable, modern 15,000-ton carrier, a 1,500-ton destroyer, and damaged a 35,000-ton battleship. An officer that was on board the USS Pensacola during the attack, years later reflected on how he couldn't help but admire how spectacular the attack had been. Lucky or not, this incredible accomplishment by the I-19 ranks among the all-time record successes of submarine warfare in any navy. Captain Kanashi, I salute you. So, what makes this attack so particularly devastating? These were spectacular tactical results, but it is the strategic aftermath that makes this attack so disastrous for the United States Navy. For the war, the IJN had planned on using their submarines to attack warships, as opposed to slow, vulnerable merchant ships. As soon as the war began, the weakness of this doctrine revealed itself. Simply put, it was hard for submarines to spot a task force in the vast ocean, and in the rare event that they did, it was difficult for them to catch up to their targets given their slow speed when submerged. So, as students of the Pacific War, you often read about how the Japanese submarine doctrine was an overall failure. However, it is here in the Guadalcanal campaign that this doctrine had yielded results. Without spoiling too much of what comes ahead in this campaign, let's analyze the strategic results Japanese submarines had. In a matter of 2 weeks, 2/3 of the carrier strength had been taken off the roster. Submarines were responsible for damaging the Saratoga and sinking the Wasp, making both miss out on the final carrier battle of 1942, Santa Cruz. North Carolina, being damaged, will miss out in the climactic surface battles that would take place in November. Both of these battles would prove vital for Henderson Field's survival. Therefore, we can see that this was one of the few times that Imperial Japanese submarines made strategic contributions to the war. And then there was one carrier in the entire South Pacific, the Hornet. Never had American naval forces guarding Cactus been so weak. Against the Hornet was the Shokaku and Zuikaku, slowly recovering their strength, along with the light carrier Zuiho. And within a month, they would be joined by 2 carriers of Carrier Division 2. That's a total of 5 carriers versus 1. A golden opportunity had been awarded to the Japanese. The question was, how would they take advantage of it? Aftermath. Noyes' tenure as commander of Task Force 61 had lasted less than a week before this disaster occurred. There would be an inquiry into his actions in 1943, and he would be absolved of any guilt. However, the damage to his seagoing career was done. He served the rest of the war on a shore command, never commanding a carrier again. Lieutenant Commander Kinashi was promoted following the sinking of the Wasp. He was given command of I-29 and was sent on a secret mission to Germany to exchange high-value strategic materials with them. Kinashi was lost when I-29 was sunk in 1944. And here's the regrettable thing for him. From what I understand, he never got to truly know how effective his attack had been. The sinking of the Wasp had been confirmed, and that achievement on its own was something he could be proud of. But it was never visually seen that he had an additional victim miles beyond the Wasp, and that he had prevented the North Carolina from participating in the rest of the campaign. I-19 continued fighting in the war, eventually being sunk in 1943 in the Gilbert Islands. If there was any bright spot in all of this, it was the actions of Rear Admiral Turner. Now, his name may ring a bell. He was the admiral in command during America's greatest naval defeat at Salvo Island. Well, he was still in overall command, and actually in tactical command of this convoy. Following the sinking of the Wasp, he temporarily withdrew his ships south. Task Force 61, now reduced to just a Hornet, retreated to friendly waters. Turner now had no air support whatsoever. Now, credit where it's due. Turner knew how high the stakes were for the Marines and how vital the arrival of this convoy was for them. He evaluated the recent intelligence that reported that the Kido Butai had withdrawn north and that no enemy surface ships were approaching Guadalcanal. So, he took the bold gamble to continue with the mission, and it paid off. On the 18th, the 7th Marines reached Lunga Point. The Marine Regiment, an artillery battalion, and valuable supplies were unloaded onto the island with no incident. The Marines' position on the island had been strengthened.